Mr. President, it's strange for me sitting with you because we were both in Iraq together in 2003, but we were on different sides. I was part of the American-British occupation, and you were fighting for al-Qaeda against the occupation. And I never imagined I would sit down like this to talk to you in this way. Welcome to The Rest is Politics Leading with me, Rory Stewart.
And with me, Alastair Campbell. And you're about to listen to an interview that Rory and I did a few days ago in Damascus, in the Palace of the People, as Bashar al-Assad insisted on calling it, which is now occupied by a man that many of you will know as al-Jalani, but actually is called now President Ahmed al-Sharaa. And a really, really interesting interview. You've just been in Saudi Arabia. Tell us what you were doing there, what you were hoping to achieve, and what you did achieve.
In the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful. Welcome to Damascus. To begin with, Saudi Arabia is where I was born. And I had always dreamed of going back there. That's at a personal level. Speaking as a head of state, I wanted my first visit to be to a major Arab country. And so, when I received an urgent invitation from the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, I took him up on it right away, because I thought it was a good idea for my first visit to be to Saudi Arabia. It's a country with a special status and influence in our region.
Does it not feel very strange to be the president now? You're in this palace that Assad was in. You've been a fighter, you've been a prisoner, you've been a warrior, you've been a leader, and now you're president. Does this not feel very, very strange?
I was a fighter, but it wasn't because I wanted to fight. And today, I am the president, but it's not because I wanted to be president. Syrians endured terrible oppression for 60 years. During the past 14 years, their society has been systematically destroyed. People were displaced, murdered, killed with chemical weapons, and tortured in the regime's prisons. The regime did not take up on any of the political solutions that were offered to it. It refused to meet any of the people's demands. After things escalated and fighting began, it was offered lots of political solutions from regional countries and the international community, but it refused any political solution and continued to destroy Syrian society.
So we say in English that the child is father of the man, and sometimes we feel that our childhood helps to make us. Can you share anything about your childhood and the values of your childhood that helped you become the person you are today?
My family comes originally from the Golan, now occupied by the Israeli state. I was born in Saudi Arabia, I lived in Damascus, then went to Iraq, and finally came back to Syria for the sake of the blessed Syrian revolution. So my life had many stages, and during this journey I was introduced to many ideas. In my childhood, I was like any other child. I lived in a neighborhood that was well off, middle class or upper middle class. I went to elementary school in Damascus, then middle school and high school. After that, during my first year in college, war broke out in Iraq. I felt that I had to go there. Our region, generally back then, was going through a difficult time. This was when the Intifada was happening in occupied Palestine, and many Palestinians were killed, especially in 2000 and 2001 and 2002. I'm from a sort of a political family. My father had been a political refugee in Iraq, and he wrote about political issues for Saudi and Syrian newspapers. We talked about politics in our home.
Your father was a a leading figure in the Damascus Spring. And in the end, the Damascus Spring was not successful. What lessons did you learn from that failure? Was the problem for the Damascus Spring ideological or tactical?
Generally, there is a strong political culture in Arab societies. But ordinary people have no experience of practical politics because Arab regimes don't let them take part in it. And without that experience, they can't have a correct practical understanding of political reality. Also, in a country like Syria, there wasn't any forum for engaging in practical politics. So the Damascus Spring was born dead.
You were in Iraq as a fighter for 3 years and then in prison for 5 years. What was it like being in a prison? How did that change you? What did it teach you? And how did you become this figure that rose so quickly through the ranks of the various organizations that involved in the insurgency?
As I mentioned, back then I was 19 years old or so when I started to realize just how much oppression there was in Syria and the wider region. The Palestinian Intifada had a big impact on me psychologically. I felt the need to learn, and I read a lot about Damascus and Syria, the incredible depth of its history and the great civilization it represents, as it is the first city known to humans. I often walked through the alleyways of old Damascus, and I could feel history speaking from every corner. But at the same time, I could see the state of the country and the appalling way that the former government was running the country. I felt pain for the burden that Damascus carried, and how the regime was abusing Syrian society and this ancient city. I believed that this regime should fall, but at that time, we didn't have the means or the experience. So I decided to go to wherever I could gain some experience. This was at the same time that the Americans were preparing to enter Iraq. There was a strong Arab and Islamic reaction against what the Americans were doing. So I had two reasons for going there. First, I saw it as an opportunity to learn and gain valuable experience by witnessing a total war, so that I could return to Syria and benefit from the knowledge I would gain. Secondly, I was driven by the passion and youthful spirit I had to defend the people of Iraq from occupation. You may not understand that, but you have to remember that I was a young man then, and I had a particular mindset. So I went to Iraq and worked with various different groups. Eventually, these groups, one by one, started to shrink and merge into al-Qaeda. And that is how I found myself with al-Qaeda.
And tell us about the life in prison.
In Iraq, I was put in prison early on. I was sent to the infamous Abu Ghraib prison, where people were being tortured. Then I moved to Buka prison. After that, I was moved to Kropa prison in Baghdad, and finally to Taji prison before being released. So during this tour of prisons, I got to know a lot of people, and I was myself becoming more politically mature. So I came to see that there was a big difference between what I stood for and some of the ideas that I was hearing from other prisoners, which were really shocking to me. I mean, this was at a time when sectarian conflict was causing a lot of problems in Iraq, and I had no part in that at all. Even inside the prison, I did not operate the same way as others. As a result, I came in for criticism from some of the other prisoners who believed in what later became ISIS's ideology. During my time in Iraq, especially while in prison, I focused on planning my return to Syria. Even before the revolution began, I talked to a few people particularly some Syrians who were also in prison. It was by fate that I was released just 2 days before the Syrian revolution started. As soon as I could, I quickly made arrangements and went back to Syria. I had set some conditions beforehand. First, that we would not repeat the Iraq experience in Syria. We wouldn't take part in any kind of sectarian war. Our focus was going to be on fighting the regime. I came to Syria with a small group of people, about 5 or 6 of us. In a year, this number grew to 5,000, and I had reached across almost all Syrian provinces. al-Qaeda in Iraq were surprised to see that. Then they wanted to do in Syria what they had done in Iraq, which I strongly opposed. This led to a major conflict between us, during which more than 1,200 of my people were killed, and I lost 70% of my forces. We regrouped. We stayed focused on fighting the regime. We also had to tackle some threats on the margin from ISIS and groups like that.
حرب النظام مع معالجة بعض المخاطر الجانبية من دواعش وغيرهم يعني.
It's strange for me sitting with you because we were both in Iraq together in 2003, but we were on different sides. I was part of the American-British occupation, and you were fighting for al-Qaeda against the occupation. And I never imagined I would sit down like this to talk to you in this way. What do you reflect over time on this experience and looking back over these years on that moment?
أنا أعتقد أنه في هذا السؤال يحتاج إلى
This question needs a very long answer. It would take about 10 episodes like this one. I'm willing to have that discussion, but given my current position, a brief answer to such a large question would expose Syria to much criticism. I don't want to put Syria in that situation right now. I'm fully prepared to answer all your questions and also add some points you may not be aware of. But we would need ample time to do justice to this question.
ثم يكون هناك مسارعة في الحلول الصفرية.
Both of us have been over this very strange journey over 22 years. What do you think it says about the fact we can now sit down and talk when 22 years ago we were fighting? What does this mean about the world?
هو أهم شيء أن
What is crucial is that policies should be looked at again. Policies need to be reviewed if we are to avoid making the same mistakes. I often changed my own decisions based on what I saw around me. I saw things happening that I did not like, and I looked again at how we were doing things. I wasn't a big, powerful decision maker then, but neither was I just that passionate young man who found himself a member of al-Qaeda. At the same time, Western policies towards the Middle East at that time were the wrong policies and needed to be changed. And we don't want the peoples of the region to bear the consequences of poor decisions every 10 years.
أن تكون شعوب ضحية قرارات خاطئة كل 10 سنوات.
Would you say now you want to project yourself to the world as a man of peace? And how do you intend to build relations with countries that remain very, very suspicious?
المنطقة عندنا تعبت كثير.
In our region, we are tired of war, and especially in Syria. Humanity cannot live without peace and security. That's what people look for, not war. So, there are many things that can bring people together and lead to peaceful solutions without resorting to fighting. What unites us as a humanity in peace is far greater than what divides us in war.
أكثر مما يفرقنا في الحرب.
Mr. President, there's a practical challenge, which is inside HTS, the old HTS, were many different movements. And some of them are more extreme. And some of them maybe would be angry that you are sitting down with someone like me. How do you manage, as you become the president, all these old factions, even the more extreme ones?
لا أعتقد يعني.
I think saying that sitting here with you wouldn't be allowed is a big exaggeration. It's not as bad as that. I used persuasion and dialogue with all these people until we agreed on a proper and suitable formula so that we could live side by side and achieve the goals of the revolution. Many people agreed on this, and through experience, awareness, and extensive dialogue and discussion, we reached very positive results without having to fight each other.
وسائل يعني سيئة وعسكرية يعني.
Some of the people we've been talking to today think that your first statements were very, very positive, very inclusive, but now want to see when is the National Congress going to come, when can they be guaranteed a constitution, and when might they hope to see elections? Do you have a clear time frame in your mind for that?
يعني في سوريا نحن نمر في عدة مراحل.
Syria is going through many stages. The priority was to stabilize the government to prevent the state institutions from collapsing. We had the Idlib government ready to take over once we seized Damascus. We allowed 3 months for this. Then we will move to the next phase involving a constitutional declaration, the National Congress, and the appointment of the presidency. We appointed a president through international conventions after consulting constitutional experts. The victorious forces appointed the president, abolished the previous constitution, and dissolved the former parliament. Now we will move to national dialogue, which will involve a wide range of people, leading to recommendations that pave the way for the declaration of a new constitution. A temporary parliament will be formed, and this parliament will establish a constitutional committee to draft the new constitution.
البرلمان المؤقت سيشكل لجنة دستورية لصياغة الدستور.
Mr. President, it must feel to you like a miracle. You've been here 55 days, and you went from Idlib suddenly to running the whole country. What was it like in those first few days? What surprised you? What was the most difficult thing about it? What have you learned most about yourself in the last 55 days?
يعني بداية أنا عندما كنا في إدلب.
We established all the institutions in Idlib that we would need, and we fully prepared ourselves for government, in terms of security and institutions and services. I was certain that a day would come when we would be in Damascus. 2 or 3 years ago, I would say in my speech that we would enter Damascus and Aleppo, and I would say this wasn't just to raise morale. I was speaking based on data. I relied on data to analyze our own strength, the social cohesion we had in Idlib, and compared that with the regime's situation, its economic collapse, societal fragmentation, and the condition of its army, as well as the interference of foreign countries inside the government.
بعض الدول الأجنبية في بنية الدولة أيضا.
Mr. President, when I was a politician, I found it very difficult to go from speaking quite a theoretical way, and then later I realized that in the world of social media, Twitter, Facebook, I needed to open up and show my personality more. Is this something that you find a challenge? Is it difficult going from being in a secret organization to then having to share more of your personality with your people?
كل مرحلة لها.
Each stage has its own circumstances. In Idlib, I engaged openly with people, managing their affairs and meeting all segments of society. So I was a political figure then too, though not to the extent that I am now in Damascus. As you know, there is a different discourse in times of war and in times of peace. It depends on the circumstances and what is needed and what is required of people in each stage.
So, for example, I've learned to speak about my children. I have 2 sons, 7 and 9. Are you going to be able to talk about your sons and your family? Will this be part of being president?
Certainly, in the position I hold today, my family will naturally be part of the picture. I don't mean they will be involved in the work itself, but people have the right to know who my family is, who my children are, and how we live. The requirements of the presidency in Syria today are different from just managing Idlib. and I believe this is a part of the role.
من البديهيات في العمل يعني.
Can you tell us a little bit about your children? Their personalities, their ages?
أنا لدي زوجة واحدة.
I have one wife, although the media often says I have more, but I have just one, and I have 3 children. We have shared living through hardships, but I made sure to shield them from any potential danger. Before we entered Damascus, I kept any information about them private, as the situation was tough. The war was still ongoing and security concerns required extreme caution.
أما في وضع السودان في دمشق يختلف هذا الأمر.
Some of the people we've spoken to today, they describe you, I don't know if this translates well, but they describe you as a control freak, somebody who has to be in control. Do you identify with that? And do you feel that in your position you have to be in control?
يعني الإنسان لا يستطيع أن يقيم
A
نفسه.
person can't really evaluate themselves. It's better to leave judgment to others than to speak about one's own qualities. I like work to be done well, and for those doing it, to be conscious of their responsibilities. It is not about control. Every task needs to be guided by strong moral values to be done properly. Given the challenge we have been through, if we hadn't maintained those values, we wouldn't be where we are today. For example, when we were advancing towards Damascus through Aleppo, Hama, and Homs, we had a big force of fighters, and Syria was deeply divided due to the regime's actions. A major issue could have easily arisen, putting national peace at great risk. If there hadn't been control and respect for leadership decisions, people might have taken actions that would have harmed the public and destabilized social order. I had multiple responsibilities, including military leadership and community management. Military leadership requires a high level of discipline and control, while community management demands a totally different approach. I don't rule society with military theories. It is a civilian matter that involves distinct methods and tools, unlike military tactics.
شأن مدني ويحتاج إلى أساليب مختلفة وأدوات مختلفة في إدارة المجتمع.
What do you think of Donald Trump?
والله أنا بالشرق الأوسط.
In the Middle East, there are many different views on President Trump during his return from 2016-2020. I believe that Trump has brought positive messages during his current administration. He is focused on domestic policy and revitalizing the U.S. economy. He is also interested in peace building in the Middle East, as it has caused quite a bit of instability over the past 2 decades. I view this as a promising start from President Trump and a positive approach to both the Middle East and future U.S. policy in the region. I am optimistic that if the ideas proposed during his campaign become reality, he will play a big role in achieving global peace, especially, in my opinion, if he ends the war between Russia and Ukraine.
لإيقاف حرب بين روسيا وأوكرانيا.
2 things that seem to be very serious about Donald Trump. Number one is that he seems to be talking about the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. He's talking about moving Palestinians to Egypt and Jordan. And then the second is the question of sanctions against Syria. What are your opinions on these 2 things?
أنا أعتقد أن ليست هناك يعني قوة.
I believe no power can drive people from their land. Many countries have tried to do it, and they have all failed, especially during the recent war in Gaza over the past year and a half. The people endured pain, killing, and destruction, yet they refused to leave their land. Over 80 years of this conflict, all attempts to displace them have failed. Those who left have regretted their decision. The Palestinian lesson that every generation has learned is the importance of holding on to their land. It would be neither wise nor morally or politically right for Trump to lead an effort to force Palestinians out of their land, in my view. Why is he pushing Mexicans out of America now? He is doing the same thing. I believe this is a serious crime that will ultimately fail.
أن تحدث أعتقد أنها لن تنجح.
And sanctions?
Sanctions against Syria?
العقوبات يعني
Sanctions were imposed on the previous regime during its systematic crimes, including mass killings. Some documents were made public, and the US reacted by imposing sanctions. Now that we have dismantled the regime and its prisons, these sanctions should be lifted, as there is no justification for them after the fall of the regime.
بعد زوال النظام.
What are you doing to get those sanctions lifted? What's your strategy to get those sanctions lifted?
والله هناك يعني توافق.
There is a strong international consensus, with everyone who has visited Damascus recently agreeing that sanctions should be lifted. Syria is currently facing major security challenges, and one of the direct solutions is through economic development. That is what we are focusing on now. Without economic growth, there can be no stability, and without stability, we risk creating an environment that fosters chaos and insecurity. All of these issues are interconnected and must be addressed together.
Mr. President, which country's economic model interests you most? For example, Singapore, Malaysia. Can you name one country which you're looking at, and what are you learning from it in terms of economic management?
I've reviewed several countries that have experienced economic growth, like Singapore, Saudi Arabia, Brazil at certain points, and Rwanda, which overcame significant challenges to its development. Each country has its unique context, shaped by its specific challenges and stage of development. While we can draw valuable lessons from these examples, we shouldn't blindly replicate them. Instead, we need to adapt and blend these lessons to create an approach that fits Syria's unique situation.
Is there any part of you that is overawed, overwhelmed by the scale of the challenge? You've got a country with a shattered economy, electricity supply difficult, oil supplies difficult, public services, unemployment. You've got a massive challenge. Is there not a part of you that just thinks, I wish somebody else was doing this?
Yes, we inherited an exhausted country, and the regime destroyed everything before we took it over. But this is the challenge we, Syrians, must face. We must rebuild our country, and we do not shy away from this responsibility. There are many issues, but a clear mind tells us we must separate them and address them one by one, and set priorities so we can succeed and grow. Nothing is impossible. Despite difficulties, with God's will, we as Syrians are capable of rising up, rebuilding our country, and making it a regional and a global success story in the future, God willing.
Mr. President, one challenge is that many of the people from the old security service, police and army have now left. And it reminds me a little bit of de-Baathification in Iraq. And de-Baathification in Iraq was a big problem because the security, the army intelligence went into the resistance and started fighting the government. How are you going to deal with this problem? Because even today in Damascus, many of the policemen are from Idlib.
First of all, there are big differences between the situation in Syria and in Iraq. Comparisons always show up big differences. First, I did not dissolve the Syrian army without having an alternative. I brought the alternative with me, an existing institution and a military academy that produces officers. There were many defected former officers who are now gradually rejoining the current Ministry of Defense. The former regime's army did not resemble the Iraqi army. It was fragmented with many militias and foreign interventions from Iran and Russia. The army was fragmented and collapsed. A large number of young men were fleeing Syria to escape mandatory conscription. So the army did not have much significance for Syrians. Today, I did not impose mandatory conscription in Syria. Instead, I opted for voluntary enlistment. And today, thousands are joining the new Syrian army.
في الجيش السوري الجديد.
When you were a fighter, did you do anything that you regret?
أنا كنت حريص جدا أن يعني لا يتعرض.
I was very careful to ensure that no civilians were harmed in our battles, despite widespread popular calls to target the cities and villages held by the regime. Just as they relentlessly bombed towns and cities outside their control, we refused to do the same. For nearly 14 years, we endured systematic bombing of our villages and towns without ever retaliating against the regime in kind. I focused on targeting the regime's core strengths, such as the army and the security forces and other groups it relied on to fight the people. I avoided any side battles altogether. It's natural for a person to make mistakes and then correct them. It is very important to be at peace with oneself, to review one's actions at every stage, identify mistakes, and most importantly, not repeat them. This has been my approach to our work. I don't claim to be free of mistakes, quite the opposite. We made some mistakes, but they never reached the point of harming civilians.
تصل إلى الحد الذي كان يعني يؤذي الناس المدنيين أو غيرهم.
What is the psychological impact of living a life which has been secret for 20 years? What does that mean for your mind, your body, your soul to have to live a secret life for 20 years?
يعني هي لم تكن سرية بالمعنى المتخفي.
It wasn't secret in the sense of being hidden and out of sight around the clock. I had a lot to do, with daily meetings all day round, along with the time allocated for public relations. I wasn't hiding in the way some might imagine, except in certain situations involving battles or war, which required caution. Hence, I did not live a life isolated from people at all. I lived alongside them while keeping some matters confidential. Now, in my new position, I don't mind sharing this with everyone because the work conditions we faced before have completely changed and we are in a new phase today.
في السابق اليوم انتقلنا إلى مرحلة أخرى تماما.
But there was a $10 million bounty on your head. It must have been very difficult to trust people if the American government was going to pay someone $10 million for killing you. It must have been stressful. It must have been very difficult.
يعني إدلب كانت منفتحة.
Idlib was very open to people. I would meet with delegations from abroad and had many interactions with journalists. I also had regular meetings with universities, professors, and various ministries. I was committed to serving the people, defending them, building institutions, and working towards reaching Damascus to topple this regime and set the Syrian people free. While performing my duties, I did not give much consideration to the $10 million bounty. I didn't believe anyone would seek this bounty by killing a person who was dedicated to serving the people.
يقضي على شخص ويسعى في خدمة الناس يعني.
Do you still consider yourself to be a revolutionary?
أنا أعتقد أن العقلية الثورية
I believe that a revolutionary mindset cannot build a country. You need a different mindset when it comes to building a country and managing an entire society. For me, the revolution, in its previous sense, ended with the overthrow of the regime. Now, we have moved on to a new phase, which involves rebuilding the country, economic development, striving for regional stability and security, reassuring neighboring countries, and establishing strategic relationships between Syria and Western countries, as well as regional countries.
دول الغرب وبين دول الإقليم في المنطقة.
Did you always want to be president? Even when you were a fighter, were you thinking this is part of politics? I want to run the country. Were you thinking that back then?
Whoever lives through an experience like ours doesn't care much about what positions they get. We are living in times where the leader makes the position. It is not the position that makes the leader. We faced major challenges, and we needed a high level of moral integrity to reach where we are today. Aiming for the presidency as an end goal is the wrong mentality. We focus on serving the people, regardless of the position we hold.
Final question for me. When you see what the Western media says about you, what makes you angry and what do you think they don't understand about what you're doing?
I don't maybe have time to follow Western media. But Syria is a crucial country with a strategic location that has a global impact. Previously, the regime intentionally displaced people to Europe and trafficked Captagon to both Europe and the region. It also used Damascus as a base for steering broader instability in the region, because of the very negative role that certain other countries were playing inside Syria. Today, Syria's situation has changed drastically, becoming a new region with a promising future. It will play a major role in regional stability, sustained through economic development. Syria will also be a key hub in sectors like agriculture, industry, and trade. It is situated on the historic Silk Road. Trade between East and the West will again thrive. The West should reconsider its view of Syria from this angle.
Mr. President, thank you. We really appreciate it. And very good luck on your trip to Turkey tomorrow.
A discussion like this requires us to be a bit more relaxed. I mean more than this. Today they took advantage of our fatigue. Next time I will come well rested and fully awake.
Inshallah, next time we can sit down. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Well, Alastair, it was quite an event. I mean, sitting there with him in with his beautiful gold tie and suit, and both of us implicated in the Iraq war, and him as an al-Qaeda Iraq man now become a presidential leader. It was also, I suppose, probably for listeners, frustrating in bits. I mean, I think as he makes this transition from secret terrorist to public politician, there's still many things he's not opening up about. I think you said afterwards that one of the things was striking is that we're the first people, I think, who've got him to admit on record that he has 3 children. But we still don't know, are they boys, are they girls, what are their ages? And I tried a couple of times to prompt him on that, and boy, was he not quite sharing what the details of those things are.
But I think this goes back to this point of being on a journey. He actually said, and you said when we were there, that the wives, and he was very adamant he only has one wife, because there are still all these rumours that he has several wives, and he's adamant he's got one wife and 3 children. But you were making the point that wives and children of these leaders are seen as legitimate targets. And therefore, he went to great lengths to make sure nobody knew not just who they were, but where they were. But he's now saying, so for example, when we were there, he did an event with his wife. His brother, who's the health minister, which itself raises one or two questions. But while we were there, he and his wife, who is a Russian, went to the opera and were sort of fated as they arrived, as they were being seen, because people were fascinated to see this guy out with his wife. So I think they accept that is going to become part of this. What I thought was fascinating was how you said in the interview at one point, look, this is a bit weird for me because essentially, I'm paraphrasing, you lot were trying to kill me and you felt that we were trying to kill you. And although he says he doesn't speak English, I could tell that he was understanding your question even before the interpreter came in. But I think even on stuff like that, he was basically saying, okay, I could really get into a long justification of why I fought in Iraq, why you people were the aggressors, etc. But he just kind of took a deep breath, sat back, and started to talk about the future again. Very, very political.
And I mean, doubtless there'll be people in his team who will be cross with our tone, but we really hope that we can follow through on his offer, which is that he's offered to do a 10-part series with us on al-Qaeda.
On the history of and the various formulations.
If he's serious about that, it would be unbelievable, because he is the most senior surviving member of al-Qaeda worldwide. I mean, he's almost the only person who can give us a blow-by-blow.
I mean, most of the other leadership are dead.
Yeah, they've all been killed.
Yeah.
His immediate final boss, I mean, obviously Baghdadi was killed, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was killed, bin Laden was killed, but the man that he eventually pledged allegiance to, who was called Zawahiri, was killed by the Americans in Kabul quite recently, after, of course, having lost a wife and children in various different attacks, which relates to your previous point. It was also, I thought, going back to our days in government, what it really reminds me of, these kind of interviews, in their sort of stiffness and their small clues, is something that we used to call Sovietology, which is when the Kremlin was at its most guarded, you'd have people peering at exactly who was appearing on the podium at the National Day parades and who was up and who was down. So we're really getting into these sort of tiny micro moments. For example, this very moving moment where he talks about how beautiful the history of old Damascus is and how he used to walk the streets and look at the buildings.
And history pours out of every wall.
Talking in a much more sort of poetical language. But then when you ask him to talk about his father and his father's revolutionary struggle, he suddenly begins sounding like a sort of 1960s revolutionary theorist. He says, this is not the moment, I don't know how the Arabic was eventually translated, but something like not the moment of revolutionary praxis. You know, the Hegelian moment had not yet arrived, rather than what I was hoping I would draw out, which is saying, you know, in the end, there needed to be a religious element. You can't just do it on a secular basis. Arab nationalism's finished.
I thought what he was trying to say there was that, well, my father was wrong, but he just didn't realize it. But he didn't want to say that his father was wrong because he wanted to respect his father. I guess the fundamental question that was sort of playing around in my head the whole time, I did keep thinking of Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, and not because of any, you know, sort of weird comparison, but just can you go from, as I believe Adams and McGuinness did, and I know that some people still won't accept that, but can you go from being somebody who really believes that violence is the way to achieve your objectives, actually to saying, that was then, now is now, and with him in particular, and this maybe applies more to Martin McGuinness than Gerry Adams, because McGuinness became an actual politician with actual political power, is whether you can not just make that move psychologically, but just as important, can you persuade other people that that is real? Because these world leaders that he's now trying to talk to and persuade to lift sanctions, or going to Saudi and trying to get financial support, whatever it might be, he's got to persuade them that he is genuine in taking a different path.
And I think one of the big giveaways there is that moment when I'm trying to get him to focus on his experience in Iraq, and he says, this is too complicated, there's too much nuance here, can we do a 10-part series on it? And that, I think, relates to your point about different audiences. There is huge pressure on him to say to people like us, I completely reject a lot of my former terrorist comrades. And, you know, he might even be tempted, who knows, to say to people like us, look, these people in the end went too far, they were extreme, they were fundamentalist, they were unrealistic, they didn't understand the modern world. But he can't say that because he's also got another audience, which is his fighters who've been with him for over 20 years, and he doesn't want to insult them. We saw that with the Gerry Adams interview. I noticed, you know, when I tried to say to Gerry Adams, look, I understand, you know, you might want to have killed someone like me who was briefly a young soldier when you were fighting, but do you regret killing civilians in the Brighton bombing? And he basically said no. And the reason, presumably, he says no is that he feels a huge allegiance to the people who fought with him, and he wouldn't want the headline to be, Gerry Adams says that what the IRA did in the 1980s was wrong. So, yeah. Final question for you, Alastair. I mean, I guess the obvious thing that will happen with this interview is that there will be a lot of people, presumably the Daily Telegraph and Daily Mail, I can predict immediately, will say, we are terrorist sympathizers who've just given a huge platform to the former head of al-Qaeda Syria. and allowed him to speak, and we weren't tough enough, we didn't challenge him enough, and that we're like a George Galloway going out to see Saddam Hussein. What was it Galloway said about Saddam Hussein again?
I salute your strength, your courage, and your indefatigability.
That's right.
We didn't do that. We did not do that. I don't know about that. It's his age-old problem. And I think one of the things I like about doing this podcast and doing the interviews the way that we do them, I've been so through the pain barrier with most of our media. I don't care what they think about the way we do the interview. We got more time than we expected. But I think if we'd have just sort of said, okay, then come on, tell us, how many suicide bombers did you send into action? He's going to say what he said anyway. And, you and I both raised an eyebrow when he said, I always made sure that civilian population was protected, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's quite hard to square all that. Look, the other thing I think people should be aware of is that his past we know about. And the people we spoke to in Syria, lots of the people we spoke to in Syria said, listen, we know who he was. We know what he was. But let me say, he is better than what we had. Because what we had no hope that things were ever going to improve because they were just a kleptocratic dictatorship. What we have now, at least we have a bit of hope that it can be different. And the question then is, how much time does he have as a, quote, normal political leader to try to get a country on its feet? This economy has been absolutely shattered.
And the stakes couldn't be higher. So my Syrian friends, who are absolutely secular, liberal, utterly opposed to that terrorist tradition, are saying, give the guy a chance. You've got to give him a chance. It's the only chance we've got. We have to lift sanctions. We have to take this opportunity, and as sort of warning us not to spend our whole time saying nobody can change, this guy's a terrorist, because their view is if you take that line, Syria's completely doomed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing that some of the experts would have been maybe listening for that they would want to have heard more about is the route to elections. Still, I think, quite vague. The interpreter in the room did look slightly terrified when translated by a question about whether he was a control freak. I think the interpreter was worried that they would think that was their view rather than our view. But we did hear that a lot, didn't we? We heard a lot of people saying this is a guy who has to be in control. But when he did cross the border with a handful of people, very interesting, one of them was the foreign minister that I mentioned, who we met in Davos, and he was in the room while the interview was going on. And they are clearly very, very close. I mean, they were talking before, they were talking afterwards, the fact that he was there. So I think that's a very, very interesting and important relationship that people will be keeping an eye on, as it were. Anyway, I hope people enjoyed that. I hope that if they found it interesting, educative, and anything else, I hope he's sincere when he says that he'd like us to go back and do 10 episodes on the history of al-Qaeda.
Well, thank you, Alastair. Bye-bye.
See you soon. Bye.